your window to the world. Every night at 9 p.m.
Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. One of the most enduring problems faced in this country has been that of housing shortage. It's starkly evident in the fact that about 100 million people live in slums in India. With increasing urbanization, this problem has only been growing exponentially. In urban areas, India faces a shortage of almost 20 million houses at present, even as reports indicate that by 2031, about 600 million people will live in urban areas, about 200 million more than at present. The Union Cabinet approved yesterday the Housing for All scheme by 2022 with a slew of measures aimed at helping people to build houses through beneficial financing, apart from redevelopment plan for slums, among other things. That this decision has not come a day early is something everyone agrees. However, how will this ambitious scheme of the government, which was announced in the budget earlier this year, to build 2 crore houses in rural India and 4 crore in urban India by 2022, work out? How will the measures announced help? What have been the roadblocks and problems faced so far in achieving the goal of housing for all? What are the problems ahead? We will discuss all this today with Sudhir Krishna, former Secretary, Urban Development, Government of India, Harsh Mandar, Social Activist and Director, Center for Equity Studies, Shubhagato Dasgupta, Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, and Srinivas Goli, Assistant Professor, Center for the Study of Regional Development at the JNU. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Sudhir Krishna, you would agree that this is quite an ambitious program which the Government of India has taken up. We have been hearing for quite some years now that housing has to be increased. Why is it that we are still lacking in creating this infrastructure?
I think the fundamental problem in not achieving housing for all is not really shortage of resources from government side. It's more of a planning issue and regulatory issue. In the sense that, overall if you see, census says that number of households and number of housing stock, that matches, more or less matches. But the quality of houses are not good. People are living in slums. So it is like there are issues of proper planning. People are forced to live in slums, which are in the heart of cities, more for the reason of economic need and their day-to-day commutation needs, safety needs. People are safer in slums. They are able to commute less, spend less time in commutation if they live in the slums than in well-developed rehabilitation.
This has resulted because several of the housing projects of the government, whether at the state level or the central level, we see the houses built outside the cities or towns lying vacant for years.
Absolutely.
Is that the reason?
That is one major reason. And in Delhi, for example, look at Delhi, a very critical, it's a typical example, I will say. Core of Delhi is Latian zone. Full of bungalows and so on, which you don't need in today's environment. You don't need that kind of, nowhere in the world you will find this kind of luxury. Followed by a whole lot of slums and haphazard development. People have converted single-story house into 3-story, making mess on the road with cars littered around. Followed by farmhouses, which are again not required today. It's just a question of planning. It will resolve. It will resolve the problem. That's how I would say.
Okay. Harsh Mandar, it is very interesting. It is said that when you look at the housing shortage, it is essentially in the category of LIG and EWS. It is said that 95% of the shortage is basically in these categories, which means that all these years the needs of these categories of people have been neglected, or is it that these people have not been provided the incentives to build themselves?
I agree a lot with what Sudhirji said before me. 95% actually, you must understand, 95% of India's housing shortage is not of absolute homelessness. There is a problem of people who have no homes whatsoever. But and that's a problem that needs to be addressed. But a much larger, 95% of the housing problem of India is people who live in housing not fit for human habitation. And I think that a core issue, I mean, even more than planning, as Sudhir said, is actually the recognition of the legal, legitimate right of people to live and work in the city. The people who work and run our city are not welcomed into the city as legal citizens. So we plan either no housing for them in the cities that we plan, or housing which is so far from their work sites that it is not going to be viable for them. So we end up in a situation where we force them to live in illegalized settlements. Because they are illegal, they are at the mercy of slumlords, they have no access to sewerage, clean water, basic services, they live subhuman lives, and they are continuously insecure, they cannot build any housing stock. So even if the state did nothing else, I mean, investment is really important, but recognizing legal tenure and planning spaces for people who work, working class people who migrate into the city and work in the city to live legally is really important. But we also have to think of a whole spectrum, you know, right from homeless shelters to working men's, working women's hostels. We need large rental housing. But, you know, I mean, working with homeless populations, I find there's 1 lakh, 2 lakh single men in the city, for instance, who are sleeping on the streets in Delhi, for instance, only because they are working, they're sending money back home, but they can't spend any money on housing because there would be no money to left home, to send home. So basic social rental housing, dormitory housing, working men's hostels, women's hostels, then rental housing of a slightly higher category, to self-owned housing, to upgraded slums. It's this entire spectrum that requires to be done.
Okay. So Dasgupta, you think that all these aspects which Harsh is talking about has been taken into consideration by what the government has announced yesterday, or the plans which we have heard for the last few months?
Not really. The announcement yesterday of the cabinet approval was for a scheme called Housing for All 2022, which is focused only on ownership housing.
Exactly.
So it in one sense can be seen as one of the instruments that the government wants to deploy and is planning to deploy to achieve the bigger target, which is housing for all by 2022. And this rental housing, for example, and a variety of other housing typologies and use typologies that are required to build a residential, functioning, sustainable city and thriving city need to be addressed through a variety of instruments. Means we do need a rental housing policy. There has been some new legislation around some of this, and one needs to see the evolution of the environment around housing itself as we discuss housing for all to be a goal for India, which has been there for a while, and it is only recently, means in the last 10-15 years, that when the government of India has kind of reached an economic has had enough revenues to put directly into housing for slum dwellers, that the scale of this debate has gone higher. So it means across all countries, the interesting part is that when the governments have enough resources in their hand, they pick up an issue like this.
Okay, Srinivas?
Yeah.
One of the things which you said is that all these things are fine. You know, good announcement, housing for all, 2022, another 7 years. But one of the key things which is said that, you know, for this to succeed, land has to be available. And land has to be available, as Mr. Sudhir Krishna was earlier pointing out, has to be available for people. And, you know, these are all ownership houses which we are talking about. How many, you think, how much land is available within the cities? And, you know, how much will it be available for these categories of people, especially the EWS and the lower categories?
Land has been a problem in the cities. Basically, if you see after 5-year plan, where we have talked about land ceiling by the government for the housing, but that has been not done properly. And if you see even cities like Mumbai, where the 50% of this land is in the private hands where we are constructing this housing for the poor, EWS and as well as LIG income groups, both the groups. So that could be the one major reason why these houses constructing for these two groups are basically not sustainable.
Not available.
Yeah, not available. And land is, that's a
Land
major
is one
problem.
of the major issues.
On land, I will say that it is not available on the face of it, but if you look around carefully, it is available. How?
In the urban area.
Yes, in urban area.
In all parts of India.
In all parts. I mean, I will say one or two examples, and which we can generalize safely, I would guess. One is that, there are redevelopment, and use higher FAR. In Delhi, we have done the government colony in Moti Bagh, and now this Iskidwai Nagar.
These are all middle class localities.
We can change. We can go in for, there are junior quarters also in Sarojini Nagar and so many other places. Go vertical, redevelop. And in redevelopment, if part of that is given away to the non-government sector, you generate resource. That is the one part of it. Redevelopment is one part. Number two, grow vertical. With proper infrastructure and mobility connection. You can have higher, egress and ingress of people on the roads.
You have been there. You have sat in the hot seat.
Yes.
You are saying that it can be done. What has been the problems for doing these things?
So we have done. I told you that we have done this
in Delhi.
In Delhi, we have done.
Which are the other cities in India which has had this kind of development?
In other cities, the government colonies, more projects we had mooted, and I'm sure it will be taking shape now. But even in private properties also, if higher FAR is permitted, which in the revised urban development, regional development, URDPFI guidelines, notified just a few months before. It has been notified, I think, in March of 2015. And in that guideline, it is proposed that you can go higher, provided infrastructure is made available. This higher FSI, higher FAR will allow, and we don't have to give individual houses. Anywhere EWS houses have been given as individual units.
Yes.
Today you can find 4 floors on that.
Absolutely.
Anywhere and everywhere in India. So therefore there is no need to give to individual, the EWS and LIG category, or anybody for that matter. Any individual plots, individual houses, we should discourage that. Grow vertical, and housing problem will be substantial. Because we should not take away agricultural land just like that, to convert into.
Yes, Srinivas.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like the TDR, which is the transfer of development rights for developing, that has completely failed. Okay.
Has failed because
that what the reasons is telling is
why has the TDR failed?
TDR is a slightly different
transfer of development.
Transfer of development right concept is like leapfrogging into future when base is not right. TDR concept is to avail by very few people. But what I said that the TDR, I'm not saying it is not good. It is required, it is possible in a given framework. But forget about TDR for a while. Existing areas which have, because suppose you provide a BRT system, immediately the road can carry more people. Immediately houses can go vertical. Suppose we mandate that every locality shall recycle solid and liquid waste. Then you don't have to load the trunk infrastructure. So you take care of waste, sewage, and then water requirement reduces if you recycle the sewage and reuse it, and if you have public transportation system. The last thing remains is power, which you can always supply. Power is not an issue. People live here or there, they consume same power.
You have to consume.
Exactly.
One point I want to say. But however, if, we are discussing this topic in a context of only the city level. But I want to say that this issue should be looked at the macro level. Like macro level with what kind of urbanization process is going and what kind of emerging urbanization patterns in India. Okay, if you look at
the smart cities are supposed to come up.
Not only the focusing on smart cities that are not going to solve our problem. We should look at the genesis of the problem. Unless you don't solve the genesis of the problem. See, if you look at the urban growth process in India, at least from the last 2 decades, see, most of our urbanization is the metropolitization of urbanization.
Right.
35 urban agglomeration consists of 50% of the urban population. Now 53 urban agglomeration in 2011 census consists of 43% of the urban population. So unless you develop, why this, and one more thing you have to realize is in 1991 to 2001, it is the natural growth which is used to contribute more to the urban growth. Now, in 2001 and 11, it is the rural to urban migration which is
Absolutely.
Contributing to
And
the
that
more.
will increase actually the rural.
And the annual exponential growth rate is actually increasing,
Right.
which is declined in the other 2 decades, which is slightly 0.01.
So which means that you're saying that the migration from rural areas to urban areas is going to increase further?
My point is we need to focus not only on our metropolitan cities or mega cities, urban agglomeration,
on smaller
but we
towns.
also focus on the smaller or medium-sized cities, so that we can stop the problem.
Harsh, this policy which the government has approved, which the cabinet has approved yesterday, also talks about bringing in private sector getting into the act as far as building houses for these people are concerned. With this is something which we have heard and seen in the last several years. Also, the private sector is supposed to come. The land is given to them. They are supposed to provide a percentage of that land towards EWS and LIG categories of people. How successful has been that effort, and now how successful do you think it will be now?
I think private investment, the idea that private investment is, for-profit private investment of the real estate structure, real estate is going to address the problems of housing for the poor is completely unconvincing to me, because even the small amount of requirements like you see in places like Gurgaon, where they've had to address, but they've done it in ways that are easily available, and people extend their own houses. There's very little really housing for the poor that anywhere in the country has been really done by the for-profit sector. I think the state has to do it. But to get into it at a more basic level, we have a growth model now which is forcing people in the millions. Agriculture is, becoming less and less viable. Millions of people are fleeing agriculture forever. They're coming into the cities. But when they come into the cities, we have not planned the cities for them. We don't welcome them. We treat them as illegal, illegitimate citizens, as I said. In a city like Delhi, it's hard to believe that the number of people living in slums is maybe 35%. It's contested because of the illegalized slums, 40%. But the amount of land that they have is only about 5%. Much of it is marginal land, low-lying land, and even that we don't accept that they have a legitimate right to do it. So I think that before we really, if we really commit ourselves to housing for all, we must say that a smart city is a city which has enough living space for its working populations near, and they'll have to be downtown in the center where they're close to their places of work. And I think that commitment of equitable, inclusive cities is there. And as I said, also for a lot of these people, purchasing housing is going to be very difficult. You need working men's, working women's hostels. You need this entire range. When you have a construction worker site, for instance, a high-rise is going to take 200 workers, for instance. We should make it mandatory and really implement the fact that you build a workers' colony for 2 years for those 200 workers and their families. They won't become homeless. They won't, move into slums. So there's a whole range and that spectrum of housing and social housing, and I think it has to be largely public investment. It's not going to be private for-profit investment that is going to solve this problem.
Would you agree with that, Sujiri Krishna? I'll come to you.
I entirely agree with Mr. Harsh Mandar's point on rental housing. I think that is one area.
Why has it not just taken off in this country?
We have not given a serious thought to it, because
no government has given a serious
absolutely
thought.
But world over, you see the countries which are capitalist, traditionally defined as like US or European countries and so on, or even the socialist countries,
right,
or even Japan,
or even in Europe also.
Absolutely, everywhere rental housing, public rental housing is the fundamental of their housing in real terms.
Absolutely.
And that has to be given attention. And you have not only the construction workers, even you have large number of people like security guards, everywhere there are lakhs and lakhs
even
of
young people into first jobs and things.
That is second thing.
Whether we have a mechanism to control the opportunity cost in the rent, in the rents, and the rent size of
the Rent Control Act
Yeah,
has become redundant now, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to make 2 points here. One is that means the operating model in India, which is public sector investment-led ownership housing, cannot be taken very far and cannot go on to achieve this vision that the Prime Minister
in the next
set
7
out.
years.
In the 7 years, it's kind of impossible, in my opinion, but even in a longer term, it doesn't allow for the right models to be in place. Means if you expand the definition of private sector and just don't look at them as the large builders, then every individual is putting his own money to build most of the housing, right? So, so even on the ownership side, the private individual sector has a real long-term interest and is the final ultimate solution. But in providing housing across the city in an egalitarian manner, there are models of rental housing where public investment is attached to it, will allow for achieving
even private investments for rental housing is something which should be quite viable.
Absolutely, I would say that private investment should be, because private investment means entrepreneurship has to be developed.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, everything government means the quality of government housing has been nobody appreciates all over the country. I'm not saying the DDA or Lucknow or some development authority, housing board of this or that kind of state uniformly. It doesn't work, but regulation is required.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately in our country, all regulators have become developers also. Development authorities are also building, developing, monitoring, planning, regulating, everything.
So there is a conflict of interest.
Absolutely. So they lose the moral right to be the monitor or regulator. So they must focus on good regulatory mechanism. The real estate regulation bill is also we have discussed that also.
So this the land acquisition bill is key to this, to the success of this housing for all. Would you say that?
Real estate regulation.
Real estate regulation. And also the land acquisition, because land has to be available.
Yes, that is.
And Harshmandan, there was a lot of talk. We have been hearing a lot of talk in the last decade or more than a decade, 2 decades actually, about in situ development of the slums and things like that. But that doesn't seem to have taken off to the extent that it should have.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, that we need to recognize that the slum dweller who has come in and living in abysmal conditions, human conditions in slums, is not responsible for the situation that he or she finds herself. They had to come into the city to survive, and the city does not have legal places where they can get affordable housing on rent or in any other way, and therefore they are in slums. So the recognition of the right of those slum dwellers to the settlement where they are in, but not completely on an as-is, where-is basis. I mean, once you give legal rights, you need to redevelop the entire slum so that you can have sewerage, you can have playgrounds, you can have schools within that same campus to rebuild in situ the slum, giving legal rights to the slum dweller. And in India and the world wide, the experience has been that if you give a slum dweller nothing in terms of vertical construction, you give basic, drinking water and sewerage and legal rights over the land, gradually the people will themselves use their entrepreneurship. That's the private sector that we need to develop, but not the for-profit private sector. On this one thing, I sort of respectfully would disagree with Sudhir. I think that I really feel that the private sector, the real estate sector, the building sector is into windfall profiteering in India, and the housing for the poor, rental housing, has to be primarily a public responsibility.
Okay, very quickly, last words, very quickly.
Yeah, I'm not with the private rental housing. I'm going with the public. Mostly we need the public investment into the rental housing.
No, I just in support of the scheme that has come out, I think that there is opportunity, if it is communicated well, that there is a beneficiary-led component to it. There is a slum rehabilitation part which can be designed as an in situ scheme, the town planning schemes of Gujarat can be applied there. And then the interest subsidy can be combined. So there is an opportunity to look at it for in situ incremental housing, but it will depend on the
Last word is connectivity. I will say transit-oriented redevelopment. People should be relocated where they can commute well and they feel safe.
I think it's a slew of measures which needs to be taken. And it's good start saying that housing for all, but it's a very ambitious scheme. As all my panelists have pointed out, there are several things which needs to be done if it has to be successful. We'll wait and watch how this will develop. Thanks to all my guests. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue, the big picture, same time tomorrow.